Thanks everybody for being here this evening. My name is Jonathan Kleiman. I'm the president of Aiqueous. The mission of our company is to amplify the positive impacts that water and energy utilities are having on their communities. And there's a couple of key assumptions in there that shouldn't go unchallenged, I think. The first is that utilities have positive effects or positive impacts in their communities. And we believe that as stewards, effectively stewards of our natural resources, that utilities do in fact play a critical role in our natural resource management and the reliance that we have on these resources for society. The second is that the sustainability and the amplitude of those positive effects is a public benefit. And there are a number of private entities, private sector companies, that might disagree that the utilities are the right entity to carry things forward, given the availability of more distributed energy resources and even more distributed water resources. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that the utility is a construct that we've made. It's a regulatory construct. They didn't necessarily choose that. I had drinks with the executive director of the Association of Energy Service Professionals 2 nights ago, and he said that, tell somebody that the business that they can be in has a 10% upside and an infinite downside, and tell them exactly how excited they would be about that business. So utilities are in a difficult situation that's partly of our own creation. And so we'll talk a little bit about this thing called the death spiral that people seem to believe that they're in right now. One more word about us is that Aiqueous is more about the IOP than the IoT. So we're about the Internet of People and not necessarily about the Internet of Things. And so what we focus on is the data associated with people, their actions, their choices, their behaviors, and also the way that the utility works with them. And so we help make those interactions visible and then create data out of it so the utility can understand what's going on with their community members. And so we'll talk about that as we discuss why I think that that aspect of things is so important. All right. Okay, there we go. All right, overview. I know that you can all take a look at this while I'm talking, and I don't want to read it to you. But the point is to spend a little bit of time talking about what a death spiral is, just to get everyone in touch with their mortality, as Matt was describing earlier, before we start talking about how is it the utilities right now seem to be caught in a death spiral, and are they really, and what are the different ways that they can get out of it. So what's going on in today's market, and this is true for both water and energy utilities, and somebody who phoned me was surprised to hear that water utilities were in the same situation, and I can assure you that they are. So sales are going down. We as societies and products are becoming more efficient in the use of resources, whether it's water or whether it's energy. We're also starting to look at alternative sources of production of these resources. So whether that is photovoltaics or rainwater harvesting, you have people who are coming up with their own distributed supplies of these resources. The fixed costs for the utilities to provide a reliable service at a reasonable rate remain intact. They have to maintain the infrastructure. We count on them today to be there in case our PV system goes down, or our rainwater harvesting system stops working, or it hasn't rained and we don't have any water. And so they still have to maintain those costs for reliability, for public health, and especially on the water side, you've got increasingly stringent environmental requirements, and they have to invest more heavily in capital. So as a result, the utilities have to increase the per unit cost just to be able to make ends meet. And what that does is, and the cost of the alternatives are starting to go down. So people are starting to do more solar, they're starting to do more distributed energy resources. Energy efficiency is becoming more prevalent. The Nest thermostat is now in the home. And so you've got competition for the traditional utility service. So what happens is customers start looking for cheaper alternatives to the resource, or they just want to be, quote, off the grid, unquote. They want to be more independent. They want to be able to produce their own resource. When utility sales hit, they have to increase the per unit cost. That in turn drives that price comparison and makes the utility look even more unfavorable. And so the logic is that that is going to cause this spiral to the point where financially the utility implodes. That's what the death spiral is, or that's the commonly conceived of notion of a death spiral. So, so I want to take a step back, all right? So this was a really cool article in The Atlantic because the utility market is not the only market that's being described as being in a death spiral. Insurance is being described as being in a death spiral right now. So this guy from The Atlantic said, where did this term come from and why are people using it all of a sudden? And so, so it's a really fascinating read. So the death spiral occurred before it was commonplace for pilots to trust the instrumentation. And they were relying upon their own body, their internal gyroscope, to be able to pilot the craft. And what happened was, when you lose sight of the horizon, you're in a fog bank, you're in a cloud, when you are turning, your body, because of the inner ears and equilibrium, you have no idea whether you're turning or whether you are actually going down. And so your body starts believing that what's happening is one thing and reality is another. And that's actually what creates a death spiral, leading to the demise of the craft. You know, you actually hit ground, and that's when you discover that that's what was going on. So when a plane enters a turn and it causes it to descend and pick up speed, the pilot only feels the descent and not the turn. So the way that the industry dealt with this is that they created instrumentation, especially something that allowed you to tell whether the plane was level and how close you were to ground. Interestingly, it took longer to get pilots to trust the instruments than it took to actually develop the instrumentation. What we take for granted now on flights that we do all the time was a significant change management exercise over a decade or two, starting in about the 30s. So the new train of thought was check your instruments and believe the instruments and not your body. And you almost had to have a new generation of pilots coming online to be able to fly safely in these situations. All right, so I was just curious about how do you take this metaphor and apply it to the utility death spiral. And so the argument was, so logic that seems intuitive needs to be calibrated against reality. And if you talk about the utility death spiral, there's two intuitive senses of logic that you might have. The first is that sales are always going to go up, right? The utility was built around the assumption that sales would continue to grow because population would continue to grow. And so you would always be able to sell more product and to be able to keep maintaining your fixed cost. And so that logic seemed intuitive, and it's not intuitive anymore. Alternative supplies and technologies have come up online. The other logic that seems intuitive may be the fact that they're heading for the death spiral. I mean, it seems, because you have to think about the assumptions that we made. We told the story, right? The story was customers seek alternatives, and they are successful. Utilities raise rates, which means that they are less cost competitive. And we automatically assume that more customers seek the alternative. I mean, that's a logical jump. Not everybody is necessarily going to do that. We may not see 85% market saturation of photovoltaic systems. We might not. Or if that happens, then somebody's going to have to step in and actually manage the process. We may get blockchain energy markets, but I mean that's a record in a registry. But I don't know if the blockchain is actually going to be able to force the electrons to go from one specific place to another. So we don't know. And because we don't know, it may be a fallacy to assume that the utility is automatically heading for this death spiral. There may be some point at which they pull out. And so that's the point of this conversation. So the trick is, if you want to use this metaphor, right, how does the utility know what level flight is? How do they know that they are still horizontal? And how do they know what ground is? Like, where is ground? Where am I going to hit? How do I land on that instead of crashing into it? So if you take this metaphor, you have to figure out what that's going to be. So I think, I mean, if level flight refers to constant heading and altitude, then level flight, it means what are your financial resource requirements? Like, how are we going to run this organization in a fiscally sound manner? I've heard people describe utilities as being mostly financial and capital entities and not necessarily technical ones, meaning that they're capable of mobilizing large capital on a grand scale to be able to provide a resource at scale and a great economy. They're not good with smaller ones, and they're not good with unstable or highly fluctuating financial situations. So they are a financial institution. And so their lifeblood is, are we going to be able to maintain a good financial basis? So a calibrated one means that, you know, we're meeting our needs. Key question is, are they taking into account what's happening, what's changing in the market, and do they have the ability to respond? So, you know, an uncalibrated situation means that maybe they haven't defined the requirements appropriately. Have they strategically defined what it is that they're trying to shoot for? That may be the first gap, is that they haven't made that pivot to figure out what is the future state that we're looking for. So there's no way for them to tell whether or not they're level. So the second one is, what's ground? Where are we going to run out of room? You know, how are we going to hit it? And so, you know, it could be an unsustainable financial performance. You could have a loss of system reliability, customer dissatisfaction. So they relate to one another, right? If you run your organization in an unsustainably sound financial manner for some time, you'll hit ground. You know, it's going to leak. If you're First Energy and you weren't tree trimming, you'll have a blackout that affects the entire eastern half of the U.S. It depends, right? It depends upon what the situation is. So, so is it possible for the utilities to get out of the death spiral? If you think about this, they need instrumentation, right? They need to be, first of all, they need to know, they need to define for themselves what's level flight, what is the appropriate financial path that we're on, and then they need good information. They need the instrumentation. So what should they be looking for? I think that they should be looking for sales, but it's not just sales of their product. They need to understand how much product is being consumed in the market. And that means understanding what's being provided by efficiency, what's being provided by solar, what's being provided by all these customer-cited resources. They need to be able to have better data on what's happening in the market en masse. If we're not becoming more efficient, but we're just starting to generate more of our own power, that's a very different situation than per capita energy consumption is going down significantly. They need to understand what the market's doing, not just their own sales. From a cost perspective, they need to understand not only their cost, but what the market is spending on these alternatives. And then they also really need to understand what the customer preferences and market choices are. That's the way that they figure out what's going on in the market. And they're well positioned to do it. They touch pretty much every customer. So if they can get this information, and that helps them figure out where they are,